4. Gateway. Sensory-specific satiety is defined as a decrease in appetite, or the subjective liking for the food that is consumed, with little change in the hedonics of uneaten food. As a result of sensory-specific satiety, when people consume a variety of foods, they tend to overeat. A greater variety of food leads people to eat more than they would otherwise. So, being full and feeling sated are separate matters. The recovery of appetite, or the motivation to eat, is apparent to anyone who has consumed a large meal and is quite full, and does not require additional energy or nutrients to meet their daily needs, but decides to consume additional calories after seeing the dessert cart. Small changes in the sensory properties of foods are sufficient to increase food intake. For example, subjects who were presented with different shapes of pasta showed increased hedonic ratings and increased energy consumption relative to subjects eating only a single shape of pasta. Exercises 1. Many marine mammals are quite large. When an ocean-dwelling species evolves toward a bigger size, it gains several advantages. First, it takes less energy and effort to support a large body in the ocean than on land, because the pressure of the water helps to support the body. A blue whale could never live on land, even if it had legs. Its massive body would require a skeleton so big that it would collapse under its own weight. Second, larger animals have less surface area, skin, compared to their overall volume, body mass, than smaller animals. A big sea-dwelling creature finds it easier to conserve warmth inside its body, while a small creature loses more heat into the water through its skin. Exercises 2. Our addiction to criticizing others is a huge block to effectively giving feedback. When we criticize, even if we choose our words with care, we are likely to assign others to a specific, potentially harmful status. We are likely to assign others, for instance, to the status of being wrong. No one likes to be labeled wrong. Most people get defensive when they are labeled, even when sure they are not wrong. And what's more important, defensive people block messages. Unless you are trying not to be understood, then criticism is not an effective communication strategy. And it doesn't help to call it constructive either. Saying something like, "I'm telling you this for your own development. Your design is all wrong," isn't going to produce positive results. Criticism is criticism. It blocks understanding. Exercises 3. After a problem which needs to be solved has been recognized, the process of defining and representing the problem may proceed with processes such as analogical thinking. To form an appropriate representation, a problem solver must often try out several different perspectives on a problem before finding one that gives insight to a solution path. One way in which a variety of representations can be found is through analogical thinking. When an analogous problem can be identified, then the solution of the present problem is partly a matter of mapping one element onto another. For example, mapping involves comparing the problems for similarity in structure and identifying their parallel elements. The solution of one problem then can guide the process of solving a novel one through this analogical mapping process. Exercises 4. Maps are made from data. These data may be positional, involving the latitude and longitude of a place, an address, a road, or a border. Some maps use statistical data to show such things as population. Others use qualitative data, such as locations of grasslands or deserts. Errors can enter when data are collected. Maps made by Geographic Information Systems, GIS, maps on the Internet, and GPS units must be digitized. That is, the data must be put in a form that the computer can read. Some of this digitizing is done by humans plotting and entering the information, and thus there is the potential for human error. On historic maps and even some modern maps, there might be a lack of data, gaps in the data, and even erroneous data. Exercises 5. It has long been the responsibility of the marketers of cities and towns to promote them as possible travel destinations by developing a brand image. First, the marketer's responsibility was to assess the city for possible places and also people of interest. These places and people were then photographed and information written about their history and stories, which was then communicated, first using print and now digitally. This branded image was both developed and then controlled by marketers. The ease of taking and posting photographs, along with visitors posting and sharing travel stories, has changed the branding process by taking control away from the marketing department. For example, visitors posting travel images online has meant that the city is no longer in control of what sites are defined as worth visiting. Those charged with increasing tourism must still develop a promotional strategy, but it will be based on encouraging visitors to co-brand along with the professionals. Exercises 6. The pedagogical tradition of requiring students to raise their hands in class has the obvious instrumental purposes of establishing classroom order, testing student comprehension of content by maintaining a disciplined climate conducive to answering questions, and facilitating group discussion. Morally, however, it regulates turn-taking, which inevitably involves issues of fairness, respect for others, patience, and self-control. How a teacher navigates in such routine situations is ethically significant. Thoughtlessly done, it may project the image of a teacher who discriminates, favors, or just does not care about students. Thoughtfully carried out, turn-taking may enable the teacher to ensure fair participation as well as protect both the less vocal students, who may need some gentle and kindly encouragement, and the more vocal ones who may become targeted for abuse by other students who grow to resent them. Exercises 7. The basic economic argument for congestion charges is well established. In a nutshell, it says that since travel times increase with traffic volumes, an additional car on the road slows down all other cars, increasing time costs for all the occupants of all the cars. The decision to travel made by the occupants of an additional car is based on their own travel costs, their private or internal costs. They ignore any increase in travel costs for all other car users, the external costs. This is inefficient when private costs are below the full social cost of the decision to travel. When decisions are made on the basis of underestimates of costs, too much of a good, in this case travel, will be consumed. A congestion charge is intended to confront users with costs imposed on other users, so as to align private costs with social costs. The charge will suppress part of demand, reduce congestion, and increase surplus. Exercises 8. Historians' approaches to the past vary enormously, but some common disciplinary features unite them. There are limits to what historians can study. They can study only parts of the past that left evidence behind, and for which evidence has survived. The dominant type of evidence has been documentary. Government archives, private papers, newspapers, and published materials have long been the most consulted forms of source. The range has recently broadened, and many historians are now happy to use artifacts, buildings, visual evidence, oral testimony, and many other non-written sources. However, regardless of the type of evidence, the point is that without evidence, historians cannot function. So all studies of history are driven by the discovery of evidence from the period being studied, and its analysis and interpretation. Historians aim to describe what happened, explain how and why it happened, and link past events to wider contexts and the passage of time. 5. Gateway. Individual authors and photographers have rights to their intellectual property during their lifetimes, and their heirs have rights for 70 years after the creator's death. So any publication less than 125 years old has to be checked for its copyright status. The duration of copyright protection has increased steadily over the years. The life plus 70 years standards was set by the Copyright Term Extension Act of 1998, which increased the 50-year limit established by the 1976 Copyright Act. Supporters of such legislation like to defend these increases with tales of starving writers and their impoverished descendants. But in reality, the beneficiaries are more likely to be transnational publishing companies. And note that copyright laws serve a dual purpose. In addition to protecting the rights of authors so as to encourage the publication of new creative works, copyright is also supposed to place reasonable time limits on those rights so that outdated works may be incorporated into new creative efforts. Therefore, the extended copyright protection frustrates new creative endeavors, such as including poetry and song lyrics on Internet sites. Exercises 1. A client of mine proudly celebrates her age and continually relies on her thinking to maximize her cognitive potential each day. At 83, she is actively involved in strategic business decisions at a financial services company. Undeterred by her numeric age, she is involved in professional projects and community programs that maintain and strengthen her brain's fitness. Whereas most people set themselves up to go on automatic pilot during their last workdays and retirement years, this is a bad state of affairs for the brain. The longer we stay actively engaged in complex thinking and meaningful work, the more energized the brain is, and the more cognitive reserves are being built. Exercises 2. Do you think the early pioneers of America thought about payback when they helped each other build houses and barns? Everyone needed help, and we still do, so it just came naturally. Today we have put ourselves into many little isolated boxes, houses, cars, and cubicles, and it is difficult to find our way out into an open space. Working in the hospital as a therapist and an administrator for many years, I know that the people who could ask for help and graciously accept it were the ones the staff most liked to take care of. Owning our vulnerability and pain makes us all more human. It creates space for others to help us, as well as to own their vulnerability. It's not such a bad place to be. Exercises 3. No one could deny, once they've given it any thought at all, that women are responsible for the majority of consumer purchases. The proof is in the numbers. Women account for roughly 80% of all consumer buying. The Center for Women's Business Research indicates that businesswomen, working women, and female entrepreneurs are the primary decision makers in households, making 95% of the purchasing decisions. To be more specific, and drive home that point. Women are responsible for 70% of all travel decisions, 57% of all consumer electronics purchases, and they buy 50% of all new vehicles, influencing 80% of overall automobile sales. Finally, women write an estimated 8 out of 10 personal checks in the United States, making their financial power even greater. Women in most households today not only control the spending of their own paychecks, but a good deal of their husbands as well. Exercises 4. Many times our greatest growth periods come through the experience of pain. Those of us who have experienced a dark time in life through serious illness or emotional trauma know the opportunity it brings for enormous wisdom and insight. Sometimes we have to experience the contrast of darkness in order to find the light. Indeed, there are lessons within our lives that may be much more apparent in the darkness of our despair because we focus more intensely when there are fewer things to see. It is like walking into a dark room. At first we can see nothing, yet after our eyes have had a chance to refocus, we begin to see particular items in the room, even though the room is still dark. Likewise, we can have some very profound insights about areas of our life that need improvement while we are quietly lying in bed, recovering from an illness, away from our hectic daily routines. Exercises 5. There are many questions we can ask about the origin of the universe, not all of which can be answered by science. Scientists can answer when and how the universe began, but cannot calculate the reason why it began, for example. That type of question must be explored through philosophy, religion, and other ways of thinking. The questions that scientists ask must be testable. Scientists have provided answers to testable questions that have helped us calculate the age of the universe, how distant certain stars are, how fast they are receding from us. Whether or not we can get a definitive answer, we can be confident in the process by which the explanations were developed, allowing us to rely on the knowledge that is produced through the process of science. Someday we may find evidence to help us understand why the universe was created, but for the time being, science will limit itself to the last 13.7 or so billion years of phenomena to investigate. Exercises 6. Increasingly, globalization may force a convergence in work hours. For example, on average, German employees work about 25% fewer hours than their counterparts in the United States. For 25 years, German unions successfully pushed for a shorter work week in hopes of creating more jobs. However, this resulted in German labor costs becoming the highest in the world, and German companies are now shifting jobs out of Germany in order to remain globally competitive. The recent addition of Eastern European countries to the European Union, EU, is expected to accelerate this trend. Facing the threat of job losses, French workers at a car components factory owned by a leading global supplier of vehicle technology voted to work longer hours for the same pay. Some saw this vote as the beginning of a de facto rollback of France's 35-hour legal workweek. Exercises 7. The idea that we are living moments of more and lives of less is supported by a recent study in which pairs of college-aged friends were asked to communicate in 4 different ways: face-to-face conversation, video chat, audio chat, and online instant messaging. Then, the degree of emotional bonding in these friendships was assessed both by asking how people felt and watching how they behaved toward each other. The results were clear. In-person conversation led to the most emotional connection, and online messaging led to the least. The students had tried to warm up their digital messages by using emoticons, typing out the sounds of laughter, ha ha ha, and using the forced urgency of typing in all caps. But these techniques had not done the job. It is when we see each other's faces and hear each other's voices that we become most human to each other. Exercises 8. The problem with most psychological tests is that they are subjective in that we must use an individual's report of his or her own experience, behavior, or characteristics to draw conclusions about that person. The responses of even the most well-meaning subjects are going to be filtered by all kinds of factors, usually involved in self-perception, not to mention the additional problems that can occur when an individual is anxious, angry, suspicious, or mentally ill. Even under the best circumstances, for instance, self-esteem tests are vulnerable to the ceiling effect, or the tendency to see oneself in a positive light when reporting about oneself. The most common problem that arises from this factor is that most people tend to rate themselves more favorably on positive qualities and less unfavorably on negative ones than they are likely to actually merit when compared with external standards.